So good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to this fourth AKC lecture of the term. Where are we? We're after Christmas. We're in spring term now, and we're looking in this unit at God controversies and exploring the nature of Christian teaching through a focus on different controversies about God, what God is, how we should think about God. And it's a great pleasure to introduce today's lecturer, my colleague Dr. Lydia Schumacher, who is Senior Lecturer in my department of Theology and Religious Studies, Senior Lecturer in Medieval Philosophy and Theology. And her topic today is the nature of divine unity or divine simplicity. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Lydia to speak to us today and give the AKC lecture. So thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. It's great to be here today, and just holler at me if you can't hear me at any point, but it's just a huge pleasure to be with you and exciting to know that you're studying theology. I was really thrilled when I was asked to do a talk on this particular topic, which I'm really passionate about, because the way we understand God, or fail to understand God, has many implications for what we think we're doing when we do theology. And as this nice little illustration here shows, sometimes theology can veer into the territory of attempting to push God into the particular box or understanding that we want to have of him, rather than allowing us to be formed and shaped by who he is in his own right. So today what we're going to do is explore the nature of God. What does it mean that he is God in the first place? And as you probably know, Christianity is distinctive in that it affirms what we call monotheism, belief in one God, from mono, one, and theism, God. There are other ways of thinking about God. Obviously, there's polytheism. If you've read Greek mythology, you'll know that there are many gods in some of these religious or philosophical systems. Another approach, which you'll learn about later in this semester from Claire herself, is pantheism, the belief that God is everything, or God is in the world. We're going to bracket those alternative approaches to theology and focus on the varieties of monotheism. Okay, let's see if I can pull off this PowerPoint. Great. Forms of monotheism. Now, Christianity isn't the only religion to affirm monotheism. Judaism and Islam can also be regarded as monotheist religions. And there's even a sense in which some ancient philosophical systems, like maybe you've heard of Plato and Aristotle, Greek philosophers of antiquity, they can be described as monotheists in a way. But what I want to talk about today are the forms of monotheism that have been most predominant in the West since the founding of Christian theology quite some time ago, really with the work of someone called St. Augustine, who worked in the 4th century. Augustine had an enormous influence on the early formation of theological thinking, the development of thinking about the nature of God and his relationship to us and the world back in the 4th century, and the way that he thought about God as simple, and we'll get to what that means in a moment, had an enormous influence throughout the late antique and early medieval period, through to someone like Anselm of Canterbury, you may have heard of, worked in the 11th century. Thomas Aquinas, a great medieval thinker from the 13th century, who in a lot of ways brought together the developments of the preceding Christian tradition and then laid a foundation as well for their further development into modernity. These thinkers affirmed that God is simple. Well, when we're talking about God being simple, there are some affinities to what we think or what we mean when we say that things are simple. I might say, oh, that exam, that was simple, that was easy, that was straightforward. But it's not quite the same meaning that we're talking about here. There's a technical meaning to the simplicity of God for people like Augustine and Aquinas. Simplicity here means the opposite of complex. And something that is complex has parts. You and I have parts. We have arms and legs and heads. And our parts are different, for example, from the parts of a tree, which have branches and leaves and so on. These parts make us complex, but they also limit us in particular ways. We have different parts than a tree has, and that makes us other than a tree in terms of the kind of being that we are. We also have, even amongst us as human beings, different features, different qualities that distinguish us from one another. I have blue eyes, some of you have brown eyes. We all have very unique personalities. And through the cooperation of our parts that make us these complex yet finite, limited beings that we are, we grow and we develop into whatever it is that we are. We grow into it physically across time, and just in the sense that we become bigger and taller and so on. But we also grow in our understanding, in our interests, and what we know. So in all these ways, we're complex, we're made up of parts. Those parts allow for us to function, and that functioning and learning and growing causes change and development. And in all of these respects, we're developing into something that's limited, something that's not like other things, that's defined and constrained in ways that other things are not constrained. But God cannot be described in any of these ways. He does not have parts. He does not change and grow and develop. And he is not limited in any way. He doesn't have one kind of way of being as opposed to another. It doesn't even apply to him to say that kind of thing. And there's also no sense in which we can say God grows up, he gets bigger, he gains more understanding. He always is the being that he is. And the being that he is beyond any kind of being that we can understand, because he is the source of all beings. And as the source of all beings, he is not limited in the ways that the kinds of beings that we know and are limited. A shorthand I like to use for simplicity, just to help myself understand it, because it is a bit of a tricky concept to get your mind around, is that God is one thing, and that is that he is always all. He is always completely what he is, and that is the source of all that is. And as such a being, he's totally set apart from the kinds of beings that we are. And given that everything that we know and we encounter is subject to finitude, to limitations, and to change and development, these are the kinds of things we can know. And since God is not this kind of being, it follows that we are not able to know God. You might think this is a sort of problematic place to end up. We can't know anything about God. He's totally other to the kinds of beings that we are and we know. What are we supposed to do then? Well, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, I mentioned that he really tried to take the prior Western tradition of theology and make it more precise and develop it more systematically than anyone had done to that point. Thomas Aquinas came along and he tried to give more precision and definition and explanation to the sense in which we can actually, in some way, know God. Obviously, again, we can't know him in his own right. We can't know a being that is beyond our understanding. But Aquinas said we can know him in a sense when we take the knowledge or the belief in him as the supreme good, the ultimate being, and we take that belief and we bring it to bear on the things that we are able to know, the ordinary circumstances of our lives, and allow it to inform the way we think about those things. So, for example, because these things in our lives are the only things that we're able to grasp immediately, we have a tendency to think of them as of ultimate importance in our lives. You know, when that's all you can see, it's just a real temptation. For example, I might think this relationship is so important to me. It's so valuable in my life that I can't survive without it. And we start to have that attitude, and it can lead us to become controlling or manipulative, or to not have enough self-worth in our own right to develop our own interests and potential. And in all these ways, ascribing too much importance to something that is limited can ultimately undermine that relationship and create problems for us with another person. Or, for example, it may be the case that I think I have to have this job. This is my dream job. If I don't get this job, I don't know what I'll do. And if we fail in the respect that the job that we wanted to get, we simply can't carry on. There are so many ways in our ordinary lives where we ascribe really supreme importance to things, and that hinders our flourishing. That hinders us from carrying on in the world and finding good ways forward, new ways forward. And this is where Aquinas thinks belief in God can come in. If I bring the knowledge that God is supreme into conversation with things I'm tempted to think of as ultra important, it can help me to gain a more measured perspective on those things. This relationship is valuable to me, but I should give another person space. I should not substitute my own development for interacting with them. Or if I don't get one job, perhaps there are other opportunities that I can explore. So you can see how bringing belief in God's supremacy into conversation with ordinary lives can help us find ways to make the best of our circumstances and really enjoy a sense of well-being no matter what may happen in our lives. So we can't know God on this account, but what we can know is the difference that belief in him makes to the way that we think about everything that we can know. And in a weird way, Aquinas says, well, we can actually sort of get knowledge of God by this means. We can appreciate the goodness in a particular job, in what we learn from a relationship, in the what we value in other people and in circumstances of our lives, and we can say, God is good in that way too. God is valuable. Nevertheless, what we have to remember at all times with this understanding is that the things that we appreciate, a job, a person, and value as good in one way or another, are always limited. Again, they're conditioned and constrained in ways that God is not. So even though there's a sense in which we can know God indirectly on this kind of understanding, what we always have to remember is that our knowledge of his goodness is based on the experiences we have, which we've assessed in light of our faith in him. And as a result, we can never, our knowledge of his goodness never captures him in full. We always have to be open to learning more about God, to learning more of what it means for him to be good through further experiences in which we bring our belief in him to bear in our ordinary lives. The advantage of this account, I'd say, is that it really lets God be God. It brings God into our lives in an everyday way, but at the same time, It allows us to recognize that he is so beyond us, he is above us, and all that we can do, or the right thing for us to do, is allow our lives to be shaped by that understanding of his greatness. Well, as great as Aquinas' feat was in terms of summarizing the earlier Western tradition of thinking about the nature of God, there were some in his time that didn't quite think he went far enough. And we have to, just to give you a little bit of context here, the 13th century, we might think, well, who cares about the 13th century? The 13th century is when the universities were founded, the first universities being Paris and Oxford, and it was the time when theology became invented as a discipline. And in fact, when all university disciplines in their own right were invented. And this was really the first time people sat down. There were academics and lecturers who said, let's get ourselves organized. Let's try and write something systematically about all the various things we might want to understand about God. So that's why these things are really coming to a head right now. And scholars, as we always do in the academic world, are interacting with one another to try and come up with the best possible explanation. So this simplicity doctrine had dominated for hundreds of years, but Aquinas' later contemporary, a guy called John Duns Scotus, came along and he really considered Aquinas' account a bit problematic. And we've already kind of hinted at what he might have found problematic. And that was that Aquinas didn't seem to allow for direct knowledge of God, for wrapping our minds around God in some way or another. Scotus said, if this is really the case, that we can't know anything about God, then the whole enterprise of trying to do theology, trying to pray, trying to speak to God and of God, this is completely meaningless. Why are we doing this? We need a concept of God that, while allowing for his supremacy over everything that we can experience, we need a concept that allows us to have some intellectual traction with God. And this is what Scotus accomplished by developing a new doctrine, not without precedent, but relatively original doctrine of divine infinity, where the infinite nature of God was put before simplicity. And what we mean by infinity here is basically that God is the sum total of all things that could exist and that do exist. He is the container for everything. And even though, obviously, as such a being, as an infinite being containing all possibilities, all realities, we cannot know God, because our minds cannot contain all that is, was, and ever could be. However, there is some correspondence between finite things, realities we actually can encounter, and the infinite God, who is the source and container of all these things. Therefore, there is a sense in which we can gain a direct, if limited, insight into the nature of God. There is some correspondence between what we know and who he is. This was Scotus's way of getting around that whole problem of the unknowability of God. Well, as you can imagine, Aquinas, or his followers at least, would come back and consider this a bit of a problematic way of thinking, because while Aquinas' account of God had him qualitatively differ, a different, completely different kind of being than the beings we know, this construal of God seemed too much to just entail a quantitative difference. For example, God is stuff we know plus, 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 plus. So, in other words, since God is kind of an agent, we think of him as someone who knows and does things. He's sort of like Superman. Or, sometimes you hear people talk about the man upstairs as if he's just a great big guy who knows everything and probably has the voice of James Earl Jones and can talk to you. This is how God works. And for Aquinas, this is way too close for comfort. This is tending too much to bring God down onto the terms of our understanding. Scotus, thought he could get around that accusation that God is a quantitative, just a bigger than us, a great big thing like us. And he did that by saying, okay, you know how Aquinas said that when I think this person is good or this job is good, my knowledge of God's goodness is limited in the way that that person or that thing is good. Well, Scotus said, no, it doesn't work that way. When I talk about things being good or wise or just, these qualities are transcendental. They come before I attribute them to specific things, and indeed before I attribute them to God. And so when I say that this thing is good and God is good, I mean exactly the same thing. There's no more to learn about what goodness entails, the goodness of God entails in this particular respect, because this thing gives me a direct insight into what God's goodness is like. You may or may not think that that argument gets around the issue of God being a great big thing like us, but later thinkers continued to find it attractive in different ways. Another benefit, I suppose you could say, of this idea of God as infinite being is that in addition to giving us a narrow glimpse into God through everything we can know and see, it allowed for what's called the project of natural theology. Natural theology is the attempt to prove things about God, or prove the existence of God, on the basis of natural resources, so our own minds or things in the world around us. Well, if you operate on the belief that everything in the world gives you a direct insight into some aspect of God's nature, then everything in the world, by the same token, gives you knowledge or proof of the existence of God. This idea of natural theology became very attractive in the early modern period, during the Enlightenment, and especially as time went on among a group of people that became pretty predominant, I suppose, in early modernity, called the deists. Deists believed that God set the world in motion and sort of left us to figure it out for ourselves. They shunned any notion of that God is involved in creation in an ongoing way, that there's supernatural, that there are miracles. And this project of natural theology, underpinned by this idea of God as infinite, really appealed to their way of thinking about how we're meant to operate in the world. But it wasn't long before philosophers started to worry about this particular construal. In the early 20th century, so-called postmodern thinkers, people like Martin Heidegger and Jacques Derrida, labeled this concept of God as infinite being under a new heading, what they called ontotheology. The idea that God is the, ontos means being, so God is the source of all beings that are or could be. He is the ground of all being, the sum total of all being. The problem with this view, in their opinion, was that precisely because it allows us to know something directly about God, by the same token, it allows us potentially to project our own ideas onto God. We get back to that God in a box. What do I want my God to be? What do I want my religion to be like? I think I'd like God to, well, as Karl Barth, a great theologian of the 20th century, said, we can't talk of God by speaking of man in a loud voice. We can't say things about God in a way that just sort of validates what we want to do and the way we want to be it. But the tendency is really there to reduce God's will to my own will, to accomplish a particular political or social agenda or something of that source, and use God as a validation for our own agendas and the things that we want to accomplish in this world. Sometimes we've seen cases where even force and violence are used because we believe so strongly that God is on our side, that God is asking us to accomplish a task which we have to ask whether it's really His or whether it's ours. And outside of the political and social agenda, we can also think just in terms of the religious context. If I start ascribing to God my particular doctrinal beliefs and my sort of idiosyncratic ideas about how we should sing in church and this and that and the other thing, pretty soon, and I think that these are sort of divinely willed ways of practicing the religious life, pretty soon there's a lot of tensions amongst even people who supposedly share the same belief in God. And they're fighting over silly things. And this looks from the outside like a bit of hypocrisy. Isn't belief in God supposed to somehow render us loving and more unified with one another? But if we can sort of pull God onto our side and attribute to Him our own ideas and plans, things can become quite problematic in the Christian context as well. That said, it is pretty easy, I would say, to, in practice, presuppose an idea of God as infinite being because of the reason that we already mentioned in talking about Aquinas. All we can know are the things around us, the things we encounter, our own experiences, our own beliefs instilled to us through our upbringing. And if that's the case, it can be really hard to differentiate what we know, what we believe, what we value from what God has in mind for us and ascribing that to Him. So a lot of the way in which we can pick up on adherence to a doctrine of God as infinite being is just by observing practice. How does belief in God play out in our lives? Are we pulling God onto the side of our own agendas, or are we maintaining an open mind, allowing Him to shape our understanding of everything that is in the world and everything, every circumstance that we encounter? Well, the doctrine of divine infinity and doctrine of divine simplicity aren't the only ones on offer. There's another one that I'd like to bring up to you today, and that is known as process theology. Process theology was actually initiated in the early 20th century by a philosopher called Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead said that the universe is fundamentally composed of processes rather than kind of entities. And things are richer and have more being the more they are interrelated with other processes. So a post or a wall or something like this is not a very complex being because it just kind of stands there and doesn't do anything. But a dog is able to kind of sense that you're there and perhaps jump up on your lap. So a dog is a little more complex. But God, of course, is the supreme being, the best being that there is, because He is capable of relating to all processes, to all events, to all people, to all things that happen in the world. By understanding God in this particular way, Whitehead and his followers want to allow that God is related to processes even that we typically wouldn't associate with him, like evil in the world and suffering and change. A version of process theology has become massively popular in 20th century theology and has continued to be developed by people like Hans Kung and Paul Fiddes, Catherine Keller, John Macquarie. I could really go on and on. But it comes under the name of panentheism. Now, this isn't pantheism, the belief that God is the world, but panentheism. Panentheism is different from pantheism in that it doesn't entail that God is the world, but that he sort of, the technical term is he prehends everything that happens in the world. So God prehends the processes by which things develop and we exist, and he prehends evil and suffering and so on and so forth. So in a way, he isn't totally reduced to all of these, but in a sense, he is defined by them. And the reason that this particular approach to theology became so popular in the 20th century comes down to the atrocities of the Holocaust. Jürgen Moltmann, who really was very much at the head of bringing panentheism into the stream of modern theology, and some of the thinkers I already mentioned, noted that, or in his understanding at least, the doctrines of God as infinite and simple, each in their own way, really tried to set God apart from the world. God does not suffer. He is not evil. He does not change. And the problem with this account is that in Moltmann's view, it renders God sort of detached and unfeeling. How can he identify with and sympathize with those who have undergone the horrors of the Holocaust and of the 20th century genocide and so on? He said, we really need a God that we can identify as having been there with us in our sufferings. And since then, since Moltmann kicked the whole thing off, this process theology or panentheism has also become attractive to not all, but some feminist theologians, black theologians, liberation theologians, Latin American theologians, who think that this way of construing God can really, this kind of God can identify with those of us who have had to struggle against oppression of different kinds and try and find a way out of it. And that's really the advantage here. I think there are these advantages that God can really meet us where we are when we understand him this way. But there are some ways in which I would speak up for the more traditional concept of God, especially simplicity, and that is that I think that potentially process theologians have misunderstood what was going on there with this description of God as totally transcendent and always completely what he is. This does not mean, to say that God doesn't change does not mean that he's incapable of love or feeling or empathy. What it means is that God always sticks with what he says he will do. God is unchanging. He is not going to change his mind about his love for humanity and his plans to make it possible for us to know him. God is not fickle. That's what the belief in God's unchangeability is all about. The logical corollary or the consequence of the idea that God can change just like us is process theologians perhaps don't notice that God could change his mind. He might feel like loving us one day and the next day not so much. We're not always very lovable. I don't think that's particularly been noticed as much as it could be. Do you want a God that you can depend on at all times, or a God who's like you but for that very reason, perhaps not so dependable. Another matter to bring up about process theology is that, one of the great advantages of it is that it allows for God to really identify with us in our sufferings and our difficulties. But this brings us back to the question, do we want a God who's undergoing the exact same things as we are? If I fall into a pit and you try and help me out by jumping into the pit with me, I don't think I'm any better off. Wouldn't it be better to have a God who doesn't jump into the same plight as you are in and as I am in, but stays in the place of supremacy and authority and power from which he can actually do something about your situation? That, in my view, would be a slightly preferable situation to have. So, we've got a little bit more time. I wanted to bring up some other aspects about process theology and some criticisms that further criticisms process theologians have raised against the doctrine of divine simplicity in particular. And one is that if you have this great supreme God, the source of everything, he's made things to be how and what they are, how does that leave human free will? Do we have free will? Can we act if God is such a supreme actor in the universe? This is the question posed, and process theology tries to resolve it by distinguishing between what's called God's primordial nature and God's consequent nature. Sorry for these technical terms, but God's primordial nature is who he is sort of above and beyond all the things that happen in the world, change, suffering, various developments and events, and so on. In his primordial nature, God is infinite, eternal, and so on. He is the potential for all things to happen. And that's the sense in which he's God. If he is the potential for all things to happen, then he's infinite, he's eternal. He does have some of these qualities that we would traditionally associate with God. So that's God in his primordial nature. But in his own right, in this sense, he is just unactualized potential. He is just a load of good and bad stuff that could happen. So what he needs is his consequent nature. And in his consequent nature, God undergoes the realization or actualization of his potential through events and circumstances that happen in the world. And the way in which this is important for us is that part of our own decisions, our choices, actually factor in here. The choices we make, not just events and things that happen of their own accord in nature, for instance, these things actually go so far as to have an effect on the nature of God. We define who God is. And our choices and the way in which they define who God is, in being kind of brought up into the life of God, they then have an effect on the future development of things. The fact that we choose to destroy our planet gets taken up into God and has further consequences. So this way of understanding God certainly does allow for human freedom in the most robust sense of the term, to such an extent that we actually, God is open to us leading him in new directions. God is open to changing his mind insofar as we can change our minds and the course of the development of things. But again, the question we might ask is, do we want a God who is subject to the shortcomings and poor choices that we sometimes make? And if we go back to the doctrine of simplicity, we may find that there are actually the problem to which this approach of panentheism is the solution isn't necessarily there in the way that panentheist thought it was for simplicity. God's omnipotence in the doctrine of divine simplicity. As an omnipotent being, the source of all that is, omnipotent just means he has every power, he has every ability to give and to create things in the world. As this being, God doesn't create us and then make us do whatever he wants. He doesn't determine our actions. The way in which Aquinas understands it is God gives you a mind and interests, and you a mind, and you a mind. And insofar as you use those abilities and skills that he's given you for your own benefit and for the benefit of others, that's all that he wanted. You're doing his will, but his will is just that you do whatever you will. Whatever you will in a way that, that contributes to your own flourishing. Now, obviously, if you used your interests and abilities to do things that were devastating to yourself and to others, that would not be consistent with God's will, because he doesn't want you to do damage to yourself. He wants you to do well. But at the end of the day, there's not a conflict there. God isn't making your choices. He isn't doing things on your behalf. He isn't interfering. He, precisely because the whole reason that he gave you your life and your mind was so that you could do with it whatever you want that leads to your own benefit and growth and happiness. So coming back to a sort of assessment of where we've been and various benefits and drawbacks, we've seen that the doctrine of divine infinity compensates in some ways for the failure of the doctrine of divine simplicity to allow us to say anything positive or direct about God. So the question I think still remains is there does the doctrine of divine simplicity leave us empty-handed? I mean, I think we have seen that there are advantages to it. Perhaps it might be preferable over some of the other ones in the sense that it doesn't allow us to ascribe our own ideas to God. It doesn't allow for the violence and the conflict that ascribing our own agendas to God can sometimes engender. And likewise, it doesn't foster a God who, while able to identify with us and our struggles and our sufferings, at the same time can't really do much theoretically to help us out of them. So in a lot of ways, it has emerged as a very advantageous concept of God. Still, it doesn't allow us to say much about God. And here's where I'd say that there is a sense in which thinking of God as simple, thinking of God as the one who is always all that he is able to allow for us to say some things about God. We can say that he's simple, for instance. We can say that if he's always what he is, that he's eternal. If we can say that he is the source of all things, we can say that he is infinite in some respect, in a different way than the doctrine of God as infinite says. We can say that he's omnipotent, that he has all power, that he's omniscient, that he has all knowledge. Here we are actually saying positive things about who God is and what he is like. We can say things about God. At the same time, when we say that God's infinite, eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, and so on, what we are describing is a being who, once again, is beyond anything that we can know. We can know things that are in time. We can know things that are in space. We can know things that are limited in their knowledge and in their capacities. So we cannot know the kind of being that God is. Nevertheless, we can know what type of being that he is. And this isn't so far from our experience if we think that, in many circumstances we learn about the type of being that something is, and that's actually quite a useful enterprise for us. I might not have met one of you, a particular person before, but you might tell me about your friend and that she has this interest and that interest, and she looks like this, and she has this feature and that feature, and she always carries this particular purse or water bottle and so on. And so I start to get a sense and form a picture of what kind of person your friend is. Even though I've never encountered him or her directly, I can't say that I know them by acquaintance. I can say that, yeah, I actually know a lot about the kind of person that she is. And this is useful to me because if you ever introduced me, or if I happen to come across your friend in some context, I'll be able to recognize her. I'll be, oh, yes, I know you. I know. I've learned all these qualities that were communicated to me previously. Aha. Well, this is kind of how knowledge of God works. In this life, we can know the kind of being He is, infinite, eternal, supreme good. We can bring that belief and understanding of Him to bear in our lives and learn indirectly about how He is and the difference that He makes to us. And this is kind of like learning about the kind of being that He is and getting that fully ingrained in our understanding, so that someday in the afterlife, the idea is that there's a seamless transition. You instantly recognize Him. You already kind of knew Him, even though you didn't yet know Him. This, I would say, is perhaps the best we can do in terms of knowing God in this life. It allows us to truly appreciate who He is without doing anything or construing Him in any way that somehow brings Him down to our level and undermines the fact that He is, at the end of the day, God. And God is not something we can see. If we think we could wrap our minds about it, we're probably not talking about God. And at the end of the day, we want a God, despite all of our inclinations to want God to do kind of what we want Him to do. We want a God. It is in our best interest to have a God who is God. And I hope that in walking through some of these concepts of God today, trying to cash out some of the details of them, that gives you a place from which to think about the different possibilities and ways of thinking about God that are relevant and in circulation today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Lydia, for a really fascinating lecture. And I don't know how she managed to cover all that ground in 15 minutes, but a really rich and fascinating lecture. And yeah, I really liked where she ended up at the conclusion. Next week, we have Keith Riglin speaking about the Trinity. And then the week after that is Reading Week. Just a reminder also to register for the AKC exam. The deadline is the end of this week. So if you've not yet registered for the exam, please do so this week. Thank you very much.
No, that's right. That's the
Those are, kind of the appliances of medieval Judaism. So, I think that they would, well, the penance is very much this divine sacrifice. But first, I also sent I think that she was one of the lyrics or something. Yeah, pleasure.